book in my room, my eyes slowly adjusting as I woke up. I looked around and noticed that Sabrina was sitting at my desk, book in hand, reading something different, I'm guessing, than when I went to sleep. It was at this moment that I also started to notice that my room had been, well organized and cleaned. I also noticed that I had this weird minty taste in my mouth. I looked up over at Sabrina and said, "Have you been doing something while I was asleep?" She put her book down on my desk and looked at me and said, "Well, I have been watching you for the last 8 hours. I had to do something. I reorganized all of your erotic fan fiction and whatnot, all of your little talk and whatnot." It was at this moment that I started to freak out. "Wait, you went through my erotica collection?" She looked at me and tilted her head slightly. "Yes, and I must say it's not all that good. Very grotesque in some ways, but for a teenage boy, it's acceptable. I also happened to give you some new clothes. I couldn't find any good ones." It was at this moment that I looked down and realized that I was wearing what looked kind of like the school uniform that she was wearing, except for, male, of course. "Wait a minute," I asked Sabrina. "What did you do while I was sleeping? More specifically, yeah, you reorganized and cleaned my room, but did you broom me and put new clothes on me while I was sleeping?" She smiled and said, "Yes. Realistically, there's only so much you can do when you're cleaning a room." I shook my head. Oh, God. Is this something I'm gonna have to deal with every day? I sighed. "Okay. Well, I guess we probably better get started on our day. I don't think I can go to school looking like this, though." She smiled. "Well, you don't have to be worrying about school. Father's sitting in the dining room. I'm pretty sure he's been talking to your parents about changing a few promises from your father's agreement." "Wait, what?" I asked her. She got up from where she was sitting and walked over to me. "It's probably better if you go ask him yourself. Come on, let's go." It was about this point that I got up from my bed, fully clothed, even shoes and socks on. This girl was meticulous. So I got up and walked out the room. And there, sitting in the dining room, was my mother, my father, and Vincent von Holt. My father looked up at me, for he was the first one to see me. "Oh, hello, son. How are you doing?" My dad's face wasn't even swollen. It looked like nothing had ever happened. I was a little confused, and I looked at him and said, "Okay, my sleep was a little weird, but what is he doing here anyways? I figured everything was done after all the stuff that had happened last night." My father replied, "Well, after some talks and some real considerations, I come to agree with Mr. Von Holt that your education could be more well served in his hands than, say our local government or any other facilities that provide schoolings for children. So I've decided that you will be taking a job training course which will help you train better for your new job that you're going to be working at with Mr. Von Holt. This may take up to a year, so I only found it fair. You will still be learning things that you normally would if you had stayed in school, which I have been promised by Mr. Von Holt, and given his expertise and his knowledge on, almost everything, I'm fairly sure you will learn quite a bit." It was at this moment that Vincent Von Holt turned his head and looked at me. "Ah, I see you're already up and dressed, and you look, ready to go. That being the case, shall we?" I looked at him a little confused. Go where?" He smiled and looked at me and said, "To my office. We still have quite a bit of paperwork and other little things that need to be sorted out before we can get you started." I nodded my head and replied, "Okay. He got up from where he was sitting, and he headed towards the door. He offered me a coat. I put it on, and we both stepped outside. And there, sitting in the front of the house, was a very odd-looking car. Very boxy in design. Kinda reminded me of the new car that Tesla put out. Looked very weird, but I gave it no mind. I walked over to it, and Vincent walked around to the driver's side. The door swung up, and he got in. He then released the door, and it opened to let me inside. I hopped in and sat down, and the first words that came out of his mouth were, "Buckle up." I did as he had instructed me to, and then I heard him say, "Ada, take us to the office." The car started up, and we started to move down the road. It was after a few moments that I looked over to him and asked, "So, what exactly is it that you do?" He smiled and jeered. "Well, you see, I do a great deal of many things. Sometimes I hunt down supernatural beings, much like your father does. And sometimes I do assassinations, deliveries, realistically whatever happens to come across my plate. Mind you, I have my standards and rules with jobs, but pretty much if the price is right and the person is willing to pay my price, I'm not one to say no. Unless, of course, it violates my own personal morals." The car ride was pretty much silent for the rest of the way. I really couldn't think of much more to ask while I let all of this kind of sink in. After a while, we pulled up in front of what looked like a large old warehouse. "Ah, here we are." He unbuckled his seatbelt and the door opened. I proceeded to follow suit. As I got out of the car and looked at this very old and run-down looking building, I proceeded to ask him, "Is this your office?" He looked at me and said, "Yes, and don't be surprised by the outside. Things aren't always as they appear. You should know that very well." He started to walk towards what looked like the front doors. Once he had reached them, he turned and waited for me. I strolled over, and then he opened the doors and we walked inside. Once inside, I was very much surprised. You know the old phrase, "bigger on the inside than it appears on the outside"? Well, this was kind of the case we were dealing with here. Once we were inside, I noticed all sorts of manner of creatures and beings. And yes, I mean creatures and beings. Demons, angels, werewolves, vampires, you name it. They were all over the place. There didn't appear to be any fighting or hostilities, which were normally accompanied by such beings being in such close proximity to each other. I wondered at this for a few moments, and then I heard off from the side a loud feminine voice say, "Ah, Mr. Van Holt, it's good to see you're back. Business is running as normal. Nothing new. Some of our field agents have returned." I looked to see who might be saying this, and to my surprise I found what could only best be described as a bunny girl. And no, I'm not talking like a girl with bunny ears, but a full-on rabbit-like human. Vincent looked at her and then said, "Ah, Alice, good to see you again as well. It's good to know business is still running smoothly, even in my absence. Has Annie come back by chance?" She looked at him and shook her head. "Ah, that assignment must be taking a little bit longer than anticipated. Oh well. By the way, this is my new apprentice." She looked at me and smiled, and then moved forward, embracing me, hugging me very tightly, my face buried between her ample bosom, and it was starting to get hard to breathe. Alice, I think you're suffocating him," Vincent said. She pulled back. "Oops, sorry."
I forget that sometimes. Well, I'll be off and let you get on with your business, sir.
She moved off as I started to collect my breath. Whew. Oh my, who was that? Vincent looked at me and said, well, that's my house manager, Alice. She takes care of the day-to-day things and makes sure that nothing really bad happens. Come on along now. Let's proceed up to my office. We proceeded down a hallway and then up a very odd staircase. It was a spiraling staircase, but not in the typical manner in which most people are used to. It would go up about a floor, and then it would seem to take a very large, circling path around, as if it was trying to go around something. It wasn't until we were at the second floor that I noticed why this design plan was made in the first place. It was at this point that we stopped, and I noticed a large creature covered in white fur seemed to move from the center of where the staircase wrapped around. And then I saw a large beguiling face looking at me. I was almost terrified at first as I heard it spoke.
Oh, hi there, boss. How are you?
Vincent looked at this large, monstrous-looking creature and began to speak to it. Oh, hello there, Co. How are you doing? It seemed to smile, and then it drew back its large hood, revealing a more softer and almost childlike face to it. And then it replied,
Oh, I've been resting mostly, just waiting for Ani to get back. Do you know if he's back yet?
he asked. Vincent looked at him. As far as I know, I just spoke to Alice and he has not returned yet. He should be back soon. Don't worry. The creature seemed to get a large, goofy-looking smile on its face, and then proceeded to simply lay back down where it was. We then proceeded up the staircase to the third floor. Once there, we found ourselves in front of a very odd and very ornate-looking door. Vincent took a moment and paused in front of it, and a large eye opened up on the door, and then it swung open. We both stepped inside, and to my amazement, I saw one of the most amazing offices I've ever seen. The walls lined with books of all different types, odd little trinkets and relics that, well, have never ever been seen by some people. It was at this point that I was directed to take a seat. Vincent walked around the desk and sat down. Okay then. There are a few things that we need to address. First and foremost, we need to make sure you have an established connection to Ada. Here, hold out your arm for me, will you? I looked at him a little puzzled and confused, but I extended my arm out over the desk. He reached out, grabbed my wrist, and then took something out from under his desk. It looked a lot like the same device that he used to put the nanomachines in my body the first time. He then pressed it to my wrist, and I felt a bit of a sting. I winced at the small moment of pain. It was a little bit painful than the first one, but not that bad. Vincent put the odd device back in his desk, and then said, "Sorry, I should have told you that was going to be a little bit painful, but I figured by now you'd be able to figure that much out." I looked at my wrist at where he had injected me, and I had noticed there was an odd little emblem where he had put it. I looked at him and said, "What is this odd symbol for?" He looked at me and said, "Well, very simply, that is my personal insignia. It helps to show who works for me and who doesn't. Don't worry, it's only visible by other people who have the insignia. It'll be perfectly hidden from anyone else. This serves for two purposes. One, you know who you can count on and who you can't. If by chance you happen to run across a rogue member, it will glow a bright red. If you're in the company of somebody that is a trusted employee, it will glow a vibrant blue. This is to help with a lot of people to know who they can work with and who they can't. This also goes for not just my own employees, but as well as my contacts. If you happen to be in the vicinity of one of my contacts, it will glow a vibrant yellow. Now, if by off chance you happen to run into someone who is, well, let's say, an undesirable or somebody who has been known to cause problems, it will glow a bright red. It also acts as a tracking device, so that if Ada needs to find you, it makes it a lot easier. Before, she couldn't track you on her own. She would have had to use my own abilities. Now she can track you and tell you where you are at any time. This also gives you an open connection to Ada to speak to her at any point in time that you need to. I looked at the spot and rubbed it a little. Kinda itched, but I figured I'd get used to it after a while. It was at this moment that there was a knock at the door. Vincent looked up. "Enter!" The door swung open, and in walked a man wearing a fox mask. He looked at me a little confused, but then looked up at Vincent. Vincent looked at him and said, "Ah, Ani, it's good to see you. I take it you've completed your mission?" The figure just merely nodded its head. "Good, very good. By the way, this is my new apprentice, Mr. Matthew Cross. I believe you remember his father." Again, the figure only nodded its head. "Well, seeing as Ko was asking about you, I'm pretty sure that he would like to see you. I will speak to you later." Again, the figure merely nodded its head, and then exited the office. I looked at Vincent. Who was that?" He looked back at me and replied, "That was Ani. He is the older brother to the rather large fellow that we talked to earlier." I was shocked. This was the older brother to that huge monster we saw before we came in? By the gods. This man is stranger than I've ever thought possible. "Okay, well, what do we do next?" Vincent replied, "Well, the next thing we need to do is we need to get your stats. Basically what your physical limitations are. In order to do that, we are going to have to run you through a battery of tests in our virtual simulator." It was at this moment that he got up from his desk and walked over to a wall. It slid to one side, and he motioned for me to follow him. Once inside, we were standing in a fairly decent-sized room, although the walls seemed to have a blocky-like shape. Kinda reminded me of the holodeck from the Star Trek TV show. My dad was always watching it, so... Here we go. "Ada, start training program. We need to get this young fellow's stats so we know what he's capable of." The test consisted of me using different variety of weapons, checking to see how much I could lift, just trying to figure out where I stand. After a few hours of exhausting testing, we exited and headed back into his office. I was quite exhausted at this point. "So, are we done?" He smiled and replied, "By no way, dear boy. Now that we have that, we now need to get you more well-suited for the work you will be doing while you are here. Come on." Seems life is moving quite fast for our young Master Cross. I hope you enjoyed today's story and you'll come back to see what is in store next. If you did like the video, then leave a like and a comment. Feedback is always greatly appreciated. Also hit the subscribe button and the bell notification so that you will be notified during our next story. And with that being said, I wish you all very well.